You never know what's going to be the outcome when you take those risks. You just don't know, because you may get hurt or you may get exactly what you've been seeking. You just don't know unless you actually take that risk. It's just like investing your money in stocks. I always say this. Is there a risk of loss? Are you going to potentially lose the money that you're investing? Absolutely, right? There's a reason there's conservative or risky. There's actually the term risky when it comes to investing, right? Now, you don't go focusing on the loss when you're actually investing in stock market, right? You're actually thinking about what you're going to gain, not the loss of it. Otherwise, if you're going in thinking you're going to lose it, then what's the point? You just never know, because there is an opportunity to gain. That's how and why so many people have done so great in the stock market. Otherwise, no one would actually invest in the stock. Welcome to the Life is a Healing Journey podcast by yours truly, Anushka, with a C. This podcast explores how you can create a true healthy lifestyle and live your life to the fullest in the face of any circumstance by healing and balancing your mind, body, spirit. If you are someone that's been dealing with disharmony in any area of your life and you are committed to seeking harmony, this podcast is for you. Let's start healing. Today's podcast is focused on the mind piece of mind, body, spirit. Just a decade ago, or 15 years or so, emotional vulnerability was not really talked about at all. And even when it was talked about, those that were being emotionally vulnerable were judged as being weak, or the ones that actually shared themselves vulnerably would be labeled as someone that easily gets hurt or frightened, rather than someone with strength and power. It was probably really not discussed much because most people avoid these uncomfortable feelings, the uncomfortable conversations. For instance, let's just say that you were the first one that was going to say, I love you in a relationship. The feeling is quite uneasy. It's unsettling. There is a little bit of uncertainty there, right? Or for instance, you go to work and you want to ask your manager for a raise. You know that feeling, right? Where it's super uncomfortable. Well, why? Because you cannot predict the outcome. You don't know what the outcome of that is going to be. When you share your heart vulnerably and say, I love you, is there going to be an I love you too in return or not, right? Or if you ask your boss for a raise, is your boss going to say, yes, you've been doing great work, or no, you're not worthy of it? You have no idea what the outcome is. So why talk about this? Well, allowing yourself to be emotionally vulnerable is also a huge source of empowerment. And the only way we can truly connect to our most loving of relationships, the ones that are the most personal to us. Plus, for many, it's a way of really releasing anything that you're holding on to. Releasing those grudges, not judges, grudges, like getting rid of those grudges that you're holding on to so that you can truly have just love for one another and not holding on to grudges, holding on to anger, resentment, whatever that is that just keeps piling on top of one another and like sweeping it constantly underneath a rug or blowing up. It's like blowing up the balloon, right? You're blowing it up to the point where there's no more room. And then boom, there's an explosion because that's just what's going to happen. No divorce just happens out of the blue. That just does not happen. It's really built up resentment, frustration, sadness, the grudges that I speak of, right? Triggers, all of it that you're holding on to for years and years. And next thing you know, one person is the one holding on to them. The other one just continues to live this autopilot life completely unaware. And the one that's been holding on to everything ends up all of a sudden saying, hey, I'm done. It's just it's like one last thing. The last straw hits and boom, no more. And then to the one that's on autopilot, it becomes a complete shock because there was no awareness. There was no communication, expression of yourself vulnerably, right? Because communication and expressing yourself vulnerably is key in any healthy relationship. That is how you create a healthy relationship. Doesn't mean you're 100% perfect all the time. That actually, more than anything, is what causes people to end up getting those out of the blue divorces, because one person or the other, maybe both, are holding on to things, suppressing, repressing. And over time, there's only so much one can handle, like the balloon, right? It's going to explode one way or the other. It is really great to sometimes have those arguments. 80%, I always say 80% uplifting relationship, and 20% there's going to be some disagreements. No two people in the world are going to agree on everything 100% of the time. And if that's the case, someone is not being truthful. I'm just saying it would be, I don't want to say impossible, because nothing's impossible. And it's just very, very extremely rare for that to happen, unless someone is truly very submissive and is just whatever and goes with the flow with every absolute thing, right? Now, this goes with any relationship, not just the romantic one. Of course, you're typically going to be the most vulnerable in the ones that you are romantically involved in, because those are typically going to be the most important relationships that you have. And that's just how it goes, because you spend the most amount of time with that one person, especially if you're living together, right? You're probably together a lot of times. And if you're anything like Ashkan and I, well, we both also work from home. So we are around each other a lot more than probably a lot of other people that have the 9-to-5 jobs that are out of the house and whatnot, right? And so in that case, it's that person that's going to know you the most, and sometimes know you better than you know yourself, right? And you never know, because you don't know how your automatic way of being is impacting another person. The key, the point of it all is, though, you are going to most likely be completely yourself, unfiltered self, with the person that you're partnered up with, because you're always around one another. You're the most comfortable with that person. And so all masks come off. No guards are typically up, right? So those are the ones that you're going to have these experiences with. And those are going to be those relationships that the emotional vulnerability is the most essential in as well. And that's because, again, when you don't do it, those are the relationships that you tend to really take to heart more than anything else. And then there will be major heartbreak. Emotional vulnerability is most typically felt as, in a sense, anxiety due to some fear of the future, right? So anxiety really is related to the future. When you constantly are thinking about where you're supposed to be, where I should be, right? Whenever you're thinking about that, and I put should in quotations, there's no shoulding on ourselves, then in that case, it's like, oh, but I'm not there and I'm supposed to be there. That can create anxiety, whether that's fear of being rejected, shamed, judged as being inadequate, whatever it is, there's that feeling that comes of how the future is going to look like. And then that becomes the underlying reason people avoid having these types of conversations and expressing themselves, because they are protecting themselves from getting hurt. And this may show up as passive aggressiveness, anger, actual aggressiveness, right? Silent treatment, even pride, right? It shows up in different ways. Anytime there is not love present and just being caring, then you know that there's something there. Now, sometimes it might not even be related to you. It might be something completely different. And it comes across to the partner as something that is impacting them, right? So in cases like that, you can also learn to express yourself vulnerably And even say, look, this has nothing to do with you. This is just something I just went through with work or a friend or whatever that may be. And I may or may not be ready to talk about it ever. Maybe for me, I always want to talk about things. I want to like talk about things right away. That's just who I am. Let's get this through. Let's figure it out, talk it through, and get it out in the open and release. And how you know that you've released it is when you think back about the argument, you actually can't remember what the argument was about. So think about that. If there is something you're actually going back to, because obviously we all have arguments and fights, right? And if you go back to a fight or an argument, do you remember why you actually argued? If you remember, then you're holding on to something. And that in itself needs to be talked about, vulnerably expressed to whoever that is. So that said, I'm going to actually talk about Brene Brown, who is truly the reason that I feel like this emotional vulnerability became such a big thing, because she's the one that I could see open the doors to having people talk about this more back in 2012, by the way. And she initially was, I remember, insulted and mocked when she did her first TED Talk about this. And it did not stop her, because she truly believed that having this emotional vulnerability, being yourself and sharing from your heart can really have benefits beyond imaginable, right? And she actually defines emotional vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And so, of course, looking back in that time, right? This, like, now it feels like it's been 11 years. It just feels like this whole new paradigm has opened up. And so let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Just think about that for a moment, right? Uncertainty is a given in every day of our lives. We are uncertain of course, the future. No one is certain of what the future holds. Absolutely, right? So uncertainty is just a part of our lives. Now, it unfortunately can be deeply tied to anxiety, as I mentioned, because again, uncertainty about the future. So what? Future related creates anxiety. In fact, very often those who suffer from chronic anxiety really have a difficult time accepting uncertainty in their daily lives. It's just tough for them to have that. And there's an aspect of control, right? There's like wanting to control how things turn out all the time, like wanting things to be predictable, which it's like that is not possible. We cannot predict the future, right? And really, it's a matter of surrendering and just being open to however things go are in my highest good. And your future is uncertain, as I mentioned, and unpredictable, because nothing can be predicted. So being open, surrendering, right? So, of course, if you're constantly focused on the uncertainty of your future, you will experience anxiety. So if you are experiencing anxiety, take a look at what is creating that. Now, if you think of it as like, oh, I have chronic anxiety, well, that's over time, it's become this habitual way of thinking, maybe having some kind of control or thought process that you want your future to look at a certain way. And so next thing that happens is this anxiety becomes chronic, right? Because then it becomes habitual. So what can you do to surrender and trust that everything's working out in your highest good, rather than worrying constantly about what the future will look like? And then there's risk. Yes, of course. Sharing your thoughts vulnerably is risky. The risk of feeling rejected if the one you love does not love you back. Or if, for those of you that watch Friends, I'm obsessed with that show still to this day. Still watch it at nighttime. That one time where Emily says thank you back to Ross when he says I love you, right? That's like literally feels like a stab in the heart. So it's that feeling of being rejected when someone doesn't say I love you back or feels the same way back. It's devastating. It's heartbreaking, absolutely. Or as I said with the boss that not only denies the raise, but will actually tell you you're not worthy of it. Like there's a fear around that. Like, what if that were to happen and all gets mocked? I mean, that actually has happened to me before. I remember, when was this? My gosh, very young. I don't even know if I was in college yet or not. I was working in real estate. So for 6 years, I actually I never got my license. I always wanted to at that time. But while I was in high school and I was going through college and everything, I worked at Remax. I had all kinds of roles. I started out as a front desk person, and then I started working as like kind of like an assistant office manager. And I even was the interim accountant. They were switching accountants. And somehow at like age 17, 18, I was the one that was chosen to learn all the accounting, right? I think at this point, I actually wasn't even in college yet. And so I had been doing all this accounting work. Accounting work is 17, 18 years old. Okay. So at that point, I felt like I deserved a raise. And I did. I went to my boss at the time and I asked him for a raise. And he actually laughed at me and he said, "No, this is just a temporary job." To be honest, if it was me today, I would have quit right then because I feel like, took advantage of someone that was 17, 18. I think he gave me like 10-cent raise, something like ridiculous, right? For being an accountant for 2-3 months and training the new accountant at that age, right? And I remember it felt very risky to make that request. And going forward, of course, that stayed in my mind. So at new jobs, it became very scary to ask and negotiate for a certain amount when I was going to either get a new job or when I was at a job when I would have multiple roles, to go and ask for a raise. Yet what I found out is the way I worked around it was when I would go and apply for a new job. And then all of a sudden, my manager at the current job would be shocked and didn't want to lose me because looking back, I know I provided so much value, literally having 3-4 roles at one point. And he wanted to match the amount that the new company was going to give me. And it was quite a bit more at that time. I think it was like triple the amount. And I had asked him for a raise and he didn't give it to me, and which actually pissed me off more because I'm like, oh, so this whole time you could have, but now that I sit here and say I have this new job opportunity and you don't want to lose me, now you're willing to give me a raise? That's not okay, right? So through that, I learned to start really just seeing my own value and what I provide and asking for those raises. Didn't always work out. And it did at the end, it really did, before all the brain tumor stuff happened. Crazy enough, I actually was promoted during my when I was on leave. So while I was going through, at that point, I believe I was actually going through radiation at the time. I was on leave after discovering everything. Which, by the way, I just had my rebirth day this last week. Today's so like last Wednesday, let's say the 23rd, August 23rd, I had my rebirth day. So 6 years strong. So it was about like, I think November-ish, around when I was having radiation, and I got promoted. I became like a staff member, which I was going to at that point start having a team under me. And I ended up never going back to Qualcomm because a year after, when I was going to go back, I got lumped in and got laid off, which everything happens for a reason, right? And I do remember it was because I had asked for a raise at that point, and my manager, he was seriously the best manager I've ever had. He had already put me on the promotion watch list. So the thing is you never know the risk that is going to happen, what's going to be the outcome when you take those risks. You just don't know, because you may get hurt or you may get exactly what you've been seeking. You just don't know unless you actually take that risk. It's just like investing your money in stocks. I always say this. Is there a risk of loss? Are you going to potentially lose the money that you're investing? Absolutely, right? There's a reason there's conservative or risky. There's actually the term risky when it comes to investing, right? Now, you don't go focusing on the loss when you're actually investing in stock market, right? You're actually thinking about what you're going to gain, not the loss of it. Otherwise, if you're going in thinking you're going to lose it, then what's the point? You just never know because there is an opportunity to gain. That's how and why so many people have done so great in the stock market. Otherwise, no one would actually invest in the stock, right? So look at it that way. Next time, every time you're wanting to take that risk, think about the stocks, because it's no different when expressing yourself in a relationship. In any relationship, being vulnerable has the potential of losing that current relationship that you have. There's absolutely that potential. Totally. But what if this relationship is just surfacey and very superficial? There's no actual depth to it. It's just plain ordinary, right? You'd never get to experience that extraordinary relationship with that person without expressing yourself, speaking your truth, being vulnerable is powerful. It's so important in any deep relationship, true connection that you have. Now, of course, there's also the emotional exposure, right? If you're truly, it's like they say, wearing your heart on your sleeve. You're emotionally exposing yourself. So yes, again, there's fear around that, right? Maybe even fear of others finding out things about you that you just don't want people to know, that you feel the need to hide. You're afraid they're going to judge you. You feel like possibly you may get humiliated or something. Who knows, right? Whatever it is, again, it's protection. So any of that, when it comes up, you're just wanting to protect yourself, most likely because something that happened in the future, or in the future, something that happened in the past, right, that you think is going to happen again in the future. So you're thinking this past experience is going to repeat itself in the future. So you're actually constantly creating this future vision that is really negative more than anything, right? Like I just mentioned, in terms of the asking for a raise, when my very first, it actually was my very first boss, when I had the courage to finally ask for the raise, and I was pretty much mocked at, right? Like they straight laughed at my face when I think I asked for like $1 raise. It wasn't even like that much. And he just kind of chuckled. So what does that do? That creates this like, oh, I better not do that again. Right. And then you get protective. It took something for me to build that courage again. And it was a lot of the transformation work, honestly, to be able to really just continue asking for that and seeing my value more than anything, right? And really seeing that, oh, I'm not being valued at the way I'm being compensated. So look at it. There's so many different scenarios. I'm just bringing this up because it's a way of, and I feel like this is something a lot of people experience too. This, right? It's always like job and relationships are huge when it comes to areas of exposing yourself emotionally. And really, depending on your personal histories, like mine, right? And even cultural backgrounds, your personality is going to be created based on these different experiences and even your behavior, right? So, for instance, like I personally, back in the day, used to view crying as weakness myself. I always thought, oh my gosh, I should never cry in front of people. It's going to be people are going to think I'm so weak, and people are going to judge me, and they're going to think that they can easily hurt me, and all these thoughts that I would have. And really, it's something that I've seen in a lot of Persian families, honestly. I've seen it in other cultures too, but really, I've noticed that things are changing, by the way. Things are actually, like, thankfully, with higher consciousness, people are starting to see that crying doesn't mean weakness, right? And that is something that really was, in a way, just instilled in a lot of kids, right? That crying means being like, man up, pull yourself together. Why are you crying? There's no need to cry, right? a lot of people have heard that. And really, it's like when you do that, it creates, from especially as a kid, right? It creates this way of believing that crying is bad, right? And there are times that when I'm on a client session with some of my Persian clients, I might just get teary eyed out of gratitude. And their response will be like, "Oh my God, I didn't mean to make you sad." I'm like, "Oh, I'm not sad. I'm like, these are overflowing tears of gratitude." Yet it's not really something that is understood as well, right? Again, things are starting to shift to a higher consciousness, and people are beginning to really accept that crying is really beneficial. So back then, I did not feel this way. And I always had to act like I was this strong and this lion and nothing bothers me and everything. I'm just shaking it off my shoulders. Like this was just how I would act. I mean, of course, I was a lot more open to those that I felt really close to that I knew wouldn't judge me. But for the most part, this is how I was acting. And I would just go home and cry on my own. And, or sometimes, like I said, in front of like some of my best friends, like a handful of girls I really trusted. Other times I would just completely suppress my feelings and act like it doesn't even bother me, even though I knew it was bothering me. So I was definitely suppressing. I'm sure there was repression too, just because I would always just say, "Nope, I got this. I got this. I'm stronger than this." Right. And so, so of course, like all that inside of me was just building up, right? The balloon. I even remember this is when I finally had this aha moment. I remember during my transformation programs back in, it was 2015 at the time. 2015. Yes. 2015, 2016, I believe. Yeah. So it was like 2015, 2016. I was in one of the transformation programs. And of course, when you're going through this massive 7-month transformation program, you are so raw, right? Everybody is very much emotionally exposed. Everybody's just there to transform. So everything comes out, like all the hidden things that you want to keep a secret only to yourself ends up being completely exposed. So we had become very close. So then a few months, I think it was even more than halfway into the program, we unfortunately had this one of the participants ended up committing suicide, which was absolutely, oh my gosh, so devastating. It was so unfortunate. It impacted every single one of us, instructors, coaches, everybody. It was very horrific, the experience of it. And I just remember at one point when it happened, I ended up really just, everybody was crying. Yet I remember that I just was holding back my tears. I was holding them back. I was like almost like crying. Like my face was very much like in the crying mode, yet tears weren't coming out. And I could feel it internally. And because I didn't want to cry in front of others. Now everybody else is crying, yet there was something inside of me. It was so hard for me to release the tears. And it was the very first time, like I said, I had this like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And thankfully, one of the other participants who I'd actually become really close with noticed me, and he took me outside into the hallway, and I just completely lost it. And so that in itself was a huge eye opener for me to realize that, wow, like, what is this thing about holding back my tears? Like, it's not that big of a deal. And that was pretty shortly before everything that I started to go through, right? Because the 2017 is when my rebirth happened, and I really fully embraced being vulnerable. I just allowed myself to just be. I was just raw. Like, this is just who I am. I, at that point, just didn't even care what anybody thought. I just said, you know what? I don't care. There's no shame in crying. I had no shame in crying in front of others and being completely emotionally exposed. I would constantly share my brain tumor healing journey publicly on social media because I was like, hey, I figured I am sharing my journal or I'm journaling anyway, so might as well just share it publicly because everybody was all curious anyway. So I just figured this was a great way to keep people posted and updated. And it was just easier, really. So that way it worked. It not only was healing for me, but I feel like it impacted other people too. And then there was a few times that I would go live. I would go live every Wednesday. I did this Wednesday Wisdom and Wellness. And no joke, I was very much nervous at the beginning. I think I've mentioned this in previous episodes. I was very nervous at the beginning, yet it just became more and more comfortable. Again, it was the uncertainty, right? It was me taking a risk, not sure how the outcome was going to be because I'd never done this before. And I was very much emotionally exposed. There were definitely times that because of the chemo that I was on, my hormones would just go off. And there was times I just couldn't even hold back tears, and I would actually end up crying on live, which I've done several times. And I was totally fine. I didn't even judge myself one bit for it. I was really allowing myself to just be me. I didn't want to put on this face, and I still don't. For me, it's like you get what you see on social media. I'm not going to just pretend like my life is all wonderful, shiny, and beautiful. No, you get me exposed. I express when I go through things. I express how I handle it. I usually do it to, in a way, say what came out of it, right? The gifts that came out of it. So usually that's what I'll do. Because for me, this is a way of getting other people open to just being okay with being vulnerable. And here's the thing. When we cry, because look, we have tears for a reason, right? But when we actually cry, it reduces the cortisol levels. It has actually been shown that the whole purpose of crying, it releases the cortisol levels and brings your stress levels down. And it actually signals the parasympathetic nervous system when you do this. Whereas when you hold it in, you're going to constantly be in that sympathetic nervous system. So think about that. You're actually doing your body a favor by crying it out, by releasing the stress within your body. This is something I talked about back in episode 7 with Let's Talk About Stress, baby, right? So if you are more curious on the sympathetic nervous, the autonomic nervous system, PNS, SNS, check out that episode where I talk more about it. Another feeling that many are afraid to really risk is the feel like I've mentioned, this feeling of shame. There's a whole thing about shame, right? It's like something that, as I've said in the frequency chart, all about the frequency, living life and frequency flow. Shame is the lowest frequency, and people avoid it. People completely try to avoid it because of how it's just not a good feeling, right? Especially if they are raised in a shame-based culture. So if you're raised in some kind of culture where there's constant shaming, where it's constantly like, oh my God, how could you do such a thing, right? Even with the smallest things, you're going to grow up constantly feel like you're going to get in trouble and that you're going to feel ashamed for doing God knows how things that aren't even that big of a deal. However, nearly everyone struggles with emotional vulnerability to some degree every day. So it's not just those that are based the way they were raised. It's not just people that have had trauma, right? Everyone to some extent struggles with emotional vulnerability, other than probably children, right? Because we've somehow or another have been taught to protect ourselves from getting hurt because something has happened. And so there becomes this whole protection mechanism to not have that happen again.
This episode will be continued next week.
Thank you for listening to Life is a Healing Journey podcast. You are here to peel and heal one layer at a time, to live your life to the fullest in the face of any circumstance, while embracing a life filled with love, joy, and peace. If you are in disharmony in any area of your life and truly desire to be in harmony and committed to elevating your health and well-being, I'm one click away. Find me at healingwithanushka.com. And remember, that's Anushka with a C. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe and share this podcast with your loved ones. Get your healing on. Until next time.